God allowed it, but he didn't support it. However, the people did. And sometimes people can make things happen, even things God doesn't want to happen. Second Samuel chapter 15. You know, we've been talking about the sons of David. We're now up to his third son, Absalom. And last Wednesday night, we got part way into Absalom. You may remember, may not remember, but Absalom was a really, really handsome, charismatic guy. He was a guy that people liked, and he knew how to make people like him. He would flatter him, and he would encourage them, and he would stand out. He would tell them anything they wanted to hear. Whatever they wanted to hear, that's what he'd tell them. He would tell them, I'm on your side. Ooh, I tell you what, if I was the judge, I would judge for you. You're right. It didn't matter what case they had. He was just trying to win their favor. You know the kinds of folks that do that. I better not say, but politicians and preachers, those kind of people. No, not really. But you know that kind that really want you to like them so much that they'll just liable to say anything to get you to like them. Well, Absalom was that way, and he was a good-looking man. The Bible talks about his hair, how he would grow his hair out all year long, and then he would cut it off in a great big deal, and they would weigh it, and it was just, he was just really doing his best. But you know the story of Absalom. If you go back and read, chapter 13, 14, 15, or go back into our archives or look at our notes, you know that Absalom ended up killing his older brother who was heir to the throne. Then brother number 2 probably died, and it left him heir to the throne, but he was exiled. He himself, he had run away after killing his older brother with cause. But he runs away to his granddaddy, who's king of a neighboring country, his mom's dad. And then after, a long while, King David invites his son back. Absalom is heir to the throne. And Absalom begins plotting and planning a takeover. He's disgruntled. He doesn't like the way Daddy's been treating him, and he wants to be king. And he's getting a lot of support to be king. And so, 2 things that Absalom needs. And tonight we're going to talk about that as we talk about the sons of David, part 2 of Absalom. And tonight's title is Smoke and Mirrors. Okay? Smoke and Mirrors. I love coming up with these titles. And Smoke and Mirrors. Absalom just had a rebellious heart. That's all there is to it. He had a treasonous intent, but in order for Absalom to succeed in taking over the kingdom, there were 2 things that Absalom needed. One thing that Absalom needed, we talked about at the end of last week, the 2 groups needed for every rebellion. One of the things was Absalom needed people, those who knew what they were doing and had reasons why they wanted to participate. Okay? Now, Absalom needed some people who knew exactly what they were doing and what he was doing, and they were a part of the plan, and they had their reasons why they wanted to be a part of Absalom's plan. Maybe they didn't like something about David, or maybe Absalom was going to promise them that in his kingdom they would get power or position, or maybe they would be prosperity, or perhaps, their reason for wanting to back this coup was because, they thought that maybe they could get a piece of the crown. Maybe they could rule a little bit behind the scenes. Those people that knew what Absalom was doing, each one of them had some personal interest in seeing Absalom succeed. Absalom was using the people that knew what they were doing as leaders. He would put them in leadership positions so that they could influence innocent people who didn't know. Because that's the second group he needed. Absalom needed people who knew what they were doing, and yet they had reasons why they wanted to participate. But Absalom also needed a group of people who did not know what they were doing. people who could be persuaded and swayed into supporting his plan, but innocent people. Because once you get innocent people involved in your plan, you can claim innocence. And that's what Absalom needed in order to win the whole nation over. And so Absalom here is really working behind the scenes. He's doing his best to get to inform a group of people and use them as leaders, and so that they can all announce at the same time. They already knew what he was going to do, and they could all announce, he's king! And because he was heir to the throne, one day he was going to be king anyway. I mean, let's just speed up the process and let's just self-promote here. And, I want it now. But he also needed that group of people who were innocent, who would be used to legitimize the rebellion. People who wanted nothing, and they had nothing to gain, and people who could not tell the difference, and they didn't know the difference between Absalom and David. They didn't know the difference. I mean, a king is a king. They all look alike to me. What's the difference in Absalom or David? I mean, come on, what's the difference? He needed those people who did not know the difference in a legitimate king and an illegitimate king. He needed, people who just couldn't recognize what he was doing. Now, grant you that these may not be the sharpest knives in the bucket, but they could be smart. They just aren't paying attention. To them, they don't have a dog in the fight. They're just going to go with, they just want to be a part of, and it was the people who knew what they were doing who were charged with convincing those who didn't know to go along. This is very common in every coup and every takeover. It doesn't happen any other way at any other time. It didn't happen any other way in heaven whenever, Lucifer rebelled against God. It didn't happen any other way in any other situation. And this particular model has been played out. It is the model for hostile takeovers. It just is. But in order for the whole thing to work, these two groups of people had to be unified. How do you unify these two groups of people? What can you do to get these two groups of people who know what they're doing and have a reason to participate, and people who don't know what they're doing but could be swayed to participate? How can you unify these into one collective bond? What kind of common bonding experience could these people have? They were religious people, but what kind of common bonding? What they had in common was religion. And so here, these two groups of people, there had to be this common experience, and the experience had to be of such a magnitude. Now, God wrote this down for us. People have used this as a playbook, okay, in order to effect takeovers. It teaches us how to take over something. But people just mainly do this by nature. It's the same factors in every one. Two groups of people who know what they're doing and people who don't know what they're doing, and a common bonding experience of such magnitude that it transcends any of the initial concerns, and it overwhelms opposition, and it demands support. Unquestioned support. How do you unify? You see, in order to unify these two groups of people, Absalom needed a noble cause. Always, you have to appeal, with innocent people, you have to appeal to their noble cause, to their willingness to sacrifice for something bigger than them. So here, he needed a noble cause, and Absalom, in order to unify these, in order to get the innocents to participate, you have to look like you are a chosen leader and not that you chose yourself. Okay? So people won't follow self-promotion, but they will follow chosen. He's going to pull off a deceptive smoke and mirrors trick. Okay? Well, welcome to the stage one man named Ahithophel. That's hard to say. Ahithophel. Who in the world was Ahithophel? Well, Ahithophel was a very well-known public figure. He had been the former prime minister of the kingdom of Israel. He had been David's prime minister and David's trusted counsel. He had helped David to build the kingdom. But Ahithophel had grown a little upset with David. As the Jews say, he's the grandfather of Bathsheba. We don't know whether or not he got upset with David and Bathsheba or whether or not he got at odds. But at any reason, he was, David was not his favorite person at the moment. But Ahithophel had such a presence and such credibility that if he joined the rebellion, the effort would be legitimized. And it would give a certain high-quality sense about all of this, and he knew how to solidify and how to unify the masses, how to get the innocents to participate with unquestioned loyalty, even in this rebellion, and how to make Absalom look chosen instead of self-promoting. And so they came up with this brilliant strategy, a strategy that has been used through the ages, is still in use today. Here's what they said. Okay, Ahithophel, come over here to Hebron with me, and you be here, and we will say this is God's idea. And you can say, God chose me. Hello? Interesting. He appealed to their religious desires to please God, and they said, come over here, Ahithophel, and stand with me while I pray and while we offer sacrifices. Let's involve God in our plan. And if we can involve God in our plan, and in fact, if we can make this look like God's idea, we can get the unity that we need. We can solidify our base, and the people that know what they're doing, they can announce it all, and the people that don't know will think it's God's idea. And so that's what they did. 2 Samuel 15, verse 10. Then Absalom sent spies through all the tribes of Israel. Spies know what they're doing, saying, as soon as you hear the sound of the trumpet, they're telling other people, this is what's going to happen, okay? We're going to take over. We're going to make Absalom king in Hebron. And as soon as you hear the trumpet all across Israel, y'all will be hearing the trumpet, 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 trumpet. He sent spies everywhere to get people ready to know what we're going to do, to participate with us. Y'all know what we're going to do, and you'll get to be at the lead of this thing. You're chosen. And so as soon as you hear the trumpet, everybody say, Absalom reigns in Hebron. Absalom is the king. David is no longer the king. Absalom is king. Long live Absalom. Wow. What a plan. But then again, you remember the innocents. Verse 11. And with Absalom went 200 men invited from Jerusalem. They had been personally invited. 200 hand-picked, personally invited people. Hey, won't you guys come with me? Come over here to my little party. But you see, the Bible says, and they went along innocently. They didn't know anything. The innocents and those who knew what they were doing, how did they solidify them? Verse 12. Then Absalom sent for Ahithophel, the Gilonite, David's counselor from his city, from Gilo, while he offered sacrifices. This literally, he brought Ahithophel not to offer sacrifices, but to stand beside Absalom while Absalom offered sacrifices. And the conspiracy grew strong. Looky there. The Bible calls it a conspiracy. It grew strong. Why did it get strong? Because all of a sudden, if we were doing wrong, would we be sacrificed to God? Would Ahithophel be here? And for the people with Absalom continually increased in number. There can't be anything wrong with something that's growing. Oh, come on now. It's the classic setup. Smoke and mirrors to make people think all along that this was not a treasonary, rebellious act. And it was planned from day one. People who knew what they were doing, people who didn't know what they were doing, and an invocation of God, an infusing of enough religious terminology and God appeal to make it look like God's idea and God's plan. But it's pure and simple a takeover, pure and simple a rebellion, pure and simple. There was no devotion to God in these sacrifices. They weren't saying, God, what would you like us to do about David? If they had, they would have gotten the same answer that David got when he talked about Saul. They knew from King David what God would have them do. So they weren't asking. They weren't wanting to know, what does God want us to do? They were wanting to act like, I was praying and sacrificing, and God told me I had to do this. I'm chosen. Ooh. They didn't even roll dice or shake bones or anything. Just saying, God. Well, prayer was but a pretense, trying to infuse a God aroma into a plan, like spice, God's spice that's sprinkled on something, trying to make it look or smell or taste like God. Fool the innocents and the undiscerning. It's just smoke and mirrors. You see, Absalom is a charismatic charmer. He flattered his way into the hearts of these innocent and unsuspecting people. If he had ever been straightforward and honest with them and told them the truth, those people wouldn't have went with him to Hebron. They went not knowing the truth. And then they got fooled by the smoke and mirrors. Ahithophel, who had been prime minister of Israel under King David, was a very opinionated man, very strongly opinionated. Ahithophel could not stand it when somebody would not take his advice. He planned on ruling Absalom and making Absalom do what Ahithophel thought he was smarter and wiser than everybody else. He was prideful. He was arrogant. He believed that he had an attitude. And this attitude put him at odds with King David. And for some reason, Ahithophel decided that he could not control King David, and so he was not going to support anything he could not control. Anything, there are some people that just, they think they're smart, they think they're sharp, but if I can't control it, I'm not going to participate. If I can't, and that was Ahithophel, and he really thought that, David's not going to change, so I'm going to back this younger man. And maybe I can control him. But all of this was behind the scenes. You see, without Ahithophel, Absalom could never have succeeded. But without Absalom, Ahithophel had no say in anything. And he wanted something that he could control. You'll always see these same players in every situation that mimics this. It's an age-old, take Lucifer. There are principalities and powers and mights and dominions and rulers over various regions under his command, various ranks and orders that went with him as his tail swept 1/3 of the heavenly host out of God's hand and out of relationship with Almighty God. It's a classic. Absalom was using Ahithophel to gain credibility. But Absalom never intended on becoming Ahithophel's puppet. Neither of them realized that they were driving down a dead-end road. Sure, the team looked good, the team sounded good, they could draw a crowd, and they could gather support. And they made all this happen by looking like and acting like it was God's idea. However, time has a way of dealing with deception, and in just a little while, these two leaders, both King Absalom and this kingmaker, Ahithophel, just right down the road here, they're both going to be dead. Ahithophel is going to kill himself because he finds out that Absalom's not going to obey him. And Absalom's going to get killed. in this treasonary takeover. However, during the meantime, things looked pretty good for them and pretty bad for David. Even though God was not backing them, things were going pretty bad for David. Even though David was God's choice, it didn't look too good for King David and his family and his followers. Here King David is, and by the way, God allows some things that he won't support. God will allow a lot of things that he doesn't support. People always go, well, why did God let that happen? God let a lot of things happen. That don't mean he's behind it. And don't think that numbers impress him either. Thank you. David did not want to go to war with his son. In all of this, David remains very unselfish and magnanimous in all of his dealings with the people. David just didn't want Absalom coming into Jerusalem and tearing up the city and killing innocent people and hurt. He cared about his family and his friends. He cared about the kingdom. He cared about, the Ark of the Covenant of God. David remained unselfish, and David was basically had this attitude, listen, if God wants me here, he'll bring me back, but I am not going to tear this place up. I'm not going to call for a sword. I'm not going to go to war against my son. I'm not going to let this I'm not going to be the destructive force here. He maintains this magnanimous spirit towards others throughout this whole unfortunate affair. He didn't want the nation divided. He didn't want the people divided. Absalom only wanted to be king at any cost, and he was willing to do anything it took. He didn't care whether it divided the kingdom. He didn't care if it tore down, the tent of meeting. He didn't care if it destroyed his father's house or family. He didn't care. He just wanted what he wanted at any cost. God allowed it, but he didn't support it. However, the people did. And sometimes people can make things happen, even things God doesn't want to happen. This lesson is not about King David, but it's rather about his son Absalom. And it behooves us to at least consider King David in this particular event. Let me tell you what I was going to read you. Can you just scroll through these verses for me, please? In 2 Samuel 15, there are a lot of verses. It's like from verse 13, I won't read them, all the way down to verse 30 and 31. But basically, here's what happens. A messenger came to David and said, listen, Absalom has the heart of Israel. Absalom has their heart. So David just said, gosh, let's go. Let's leave the city. We don't want the city torn up. And David's men come to him and say, listen, we'll do anything you want us to do. We'll stay here and fight, or we'll go with you. Whatever you choose for us to do. And David said, let's go. And so one by one, they began to leave the city and go to the outskirts of the city. And even the Levites wanted to go with David. And they picked up the Ark of the Covenant, two of them did, and carried it out of the city and set it down while all the people crossed over the Kidron River. And David said, no. Don't bring the Ark of the Covenant with us. The Ark of the Covenant, I can't presume that the glory of God is with me. I don't want the glory. Take it back to the house of God. And so as the priest watched everybody cross over, they ended up obeying David and taking the Ark of the Covenant. David wasn't looking for glory. He was just at the mercy of God. He said, if God wants me back here, he'll bring me back here, but I can't fight against my son. Some of the people that were crossing over the Kidron to go with David, one man came up. His name was, man's name was Ittai. He had come to David years earlier when David was living and running from Saul. He had 600 men that lived with David. They were from Gath. They weren't Jews, most likely. They were Philistines. And he was a Philistine leader, and he led 600 men to help David. And David, he came out, his 600 men with him, to cross over and go into the wilderness with David. And David said, oh, no, listen, don't go with me. Gosh, you left your home. You're in exile from your home and from your family. And you know, if you and your men go with me, you'll put yourself in further harm. Why don't you just go back into the city? I'm sure Absalom will be good to you, and you can join his army. And you know, because gosh, you've been such a good friend. I don't want to tear you away from something that you know, you're a man without a country. You gave your heart and your life to me, and your 600 men fought for me to get this kingdom. Just go back and rest in the city, and you know, you've done enough. And this man, this commander of the 600 men, said to him, "No, my lord. As the Lord lives and as my king lives, wherever you are, that's where I will be. Whether in death or in life, I'm with you." And David just bows his head and said, "Cross on over." This man crossed on over with his 600 men and went with David out into the wilderness with no place, and carried his little kids with him and his family and took them out of their home into the wilderness. Later, by the way, we find this man as one of the 3 captains of the armies of Israel. He shared, even though he was from Gath, he shared the same rank and position as Joab and Abishai. Why? Because he was a man that could be trusted. Wow, what a story. What a story. You can read that. But we get down to verse 30. Verse 29 is where they carry the ark of the covenant back into Israel. Verse 30, so David went up as well. David went on across the Kidron Valley. If you've ever been there, the Kidron Valley begins at the city of David, goes down a hill for about 65 or 70 yards, crosses the Kidron Valley. That's how close it is to the city. And then it immediately begins going up the Mount of Olives. And so David went up by the ascent to the Mount of Olives. And he wept as he went. He was brokenhearted. And he had his head covered, and he went barefoot. He was chastising himself, covering his head and walking barefoot. He wasn't looking for power or position. He was trying his best to impress God, not man. And all the people who were with him covered their heads and went up weeping as they went. They were just following their leader with a heart after God. Then someone told David, saying, Ahithophel, your former prime minister, you know, your granddaddy-in-law, as the Jews believe, Ahithophel, such a smart and a wise man, Ahithophel is among the conspirators with Absalom. And David said, "O Lord." And David understood, oh gosh, I'm in trouble now. And indeed, if Absalom had have listened to Ahithophel, David would have been dead. So David said, "O Lord, I pray, turn the counsel of Ahithophel into foolishness." Wow. As I said earlier, the lesson's not about David, it's about his sons. But David figures so heavily into his sons, especially here in the son of Absalom. Let me cut to the chase as we close and tell you, number one, what we learned tonight. Number one, God does not commit to a man's charisma. People are impressed with charisma, but not God. God commits to character, not charisma. It's hard to impress God with flattery. Number two, God is not impressed with numbers. Just because something is big and growing, or just because something increases. You know, God is the one that had to enlarge hell. He's not impressed with numbers. Number three, God does not divide his kingdom. He does not. God does not divide his kingdom. And anyone who does is not called by God to do it. That's just the truth. God does not divide your family. Do you know that the devil can't divide your family unless he can get somebody to work with him? He's got to get somebody to work with him. The devil cannot divide the kingdom or a church unless he can get somebody to work with him. And it's got to be somebody on the inside. Number 4, God does not support everything he allows. Some years ago, I went to counsel with a pastor, and I started telling him some things that I felt as though that he needed to hear. And he said, how dare you tell me this? Look at my church. My church is bigger than your church. We're doing great. God's got to be on my side, or we wouldn't be doing this great. That church doesn't exist anymore, by the way. God does not support everything he allows. And number 5, we need to keep a humble heart like David had when we're going through difficulties, and we need to keep our future in God's hands. Your future was never in your hands. And it's not in anyone else's hands either. Okay? Keep a humble heart.